Alright, this is energy from biomass, which is going to be topic 6.7. Alright, let me get us going here. Okay, energy from biomass, topic 6.7. So our objective today is to describe the effects of the use of biomass in power generation on the environment. And so we have just finished off our non-renewable energy sources, and now we're going to look at our renewable energy sources. And so we're going to be looking at chapter 15 in the textbook, and it's the second half of unit 6 for us. There are 4 vocabulary terms: biomass, ethanol, net energy yield, and carbon neutral, and we'll cover those as we go through. I want to encourage you to highlight those terms in context within the questions to make sure that that you have a good understanding of the words. Okay, so first thing we have to know is what is biomass and what are some examples of biomass. Biomass is material that is living or once living. And by once living, we need to kind of have a caveat to that and say recently living. Because technically the material in coal, oil, and natural gas, parts of that were once living, but it's too far back. So we're talking about recent material. So bio meaning life, mass meaning, material or weight. So living or once living material that can be burned to generate electricity or energy. And so we've been doing this since the beginning of time. Wood, crop residues, alcohol fuels, garbage, landfill gas or methane. Some communities burn animal manure or dung, all as sources of heat and light for our energy needs. So the big question is biomass sustainable? And kind of like we always say in environmental science, it depends. The important part for us to understand is that because we're talking about plants that were living or recently living, they have captured carbon dioxide. And if they've captured carbon dioxide in their cells, and then when it is combusted, that carbon dioxide is released, there really is no net change in the amount of carbon. That's because of the law of conservation of mass. They can't release any more carbon than what they initially absorbed. So any greenhouse gas released is equivalent to the amount of greenhouse gases that plant absorbed during its lifetime. The problem with that is that if we're growing crops for fuel, for biomass, and we're using fossil fuels in the production of those crops, then that's not really being done sustainably. But if we're talking about things that are growing on their own without any extra, intensive agriculture, and then we are collecting and burning those things without the use of fossil fuel, the net energy yield is, or I'm sorry, not the net energy yield, but the carbon yield is neutral. It would be carbon neutral. And then just like we've talked about before, but if you cut down forests faster than they can be replenished, then that's not going to be a sustainable practice either. So yes, it is sustainable and renewable as long as it's done at a replenishment rate, and as long as it's done without the use of fossil fuels. So what are the benefits of burning biomass? The first thing is that there is no net release of greenhouse gases. It's one of your vocab words. It's a carbon neutral process as long as fossil fuels aren't used in the production or harvesting of those. We can often use things that are left over that otherwise would be waste to generate electricity. So for example, the gases that are produced in landfills technically are part of biomass, and they could be burned to generate electricity. They're just sitting there. Why don't we use it? Same thing with crop residues, like what's left over from corn or sugarcane production. Those are all wastes. They would just be thrown in a pile somewhere. If we can generate electricity from that, then we're actually improving our energy efficiency. So with that, some types of agriculture can actually be energy independent. They can even use, dairies can run off the manure that the cows produce in the milking barns. But there's some startup cost to that, and there's some technology that can make that difficult for farms to use, but they could at least, if they were able to get those improvements to their farms, they would be able to either become energy independent or at least a little more off the grid. And biomass is readily available because there's living things all around us, particularly in developing countries where they may not have access to an energy grid. Okay, so but what are the drawbacks of biomass combustion? It is still combustion, so it's still going to release carbon dioxide and water vapor, both of which are greenhouse gases, but remember, it's not releasing any more than what it has absorbed. Like we talked several times before already, if it's not collected and harvested sustainably, we will eventually run out, like what we're seeing happen with many of our forests. When we burn trash, so when we talk about waste management, one of the things we'll talk about is, we can take trash that would normally go in a landfill, incinerate it or burn it, and then it takes up less space, and we can use the heat from that to generate electricity. The problem is that you're not just releasing, because it's not just plants, in that trash you can release other pollutants, things like lead and mercury. They can be really harmful to people. We've talked about how if crops are grown using fossil fuels, even if that's not reported, it is technically part of the carbon cost for biomass. And then the big thing, particularly in developing countries, is the local air quality. If you're burning biomass, you're going to be releasing soot and smoke, and so that is both a respiratory irritant and it blocks sunlight. It becomes hazy. Particularly women and children who may spend a portion of the day inside doing cooking and heating water and all of that. If they're burning biomass, they're being exposed to that, and so it does reduce life expectancy because they're constantly being exposed to high levels of smoke and air pollution. Okay, so let's talk about carbon yield. So we're going to compare biomass and fossil fuels because both of them technically came from living things. One is just recent and one is ancient. Biomass is the current carbon because it's been recently collected in that plant that is, living or very recently living, and then burned. And so the net yield for carbon is 0. We would call that carbon neutral. The faster a crop grows, the faster the turnover is. So if something takes 5 months to grow, it's only going to absorb 5 months of carbon, but it's also only going to release 5 months of carbon. If you're burning a tree that's 50 years old, it has absorbed 50 years of carbon, and then it will release 50 years of carbon. So the faster turnover you have, the less impact you may see initially. Fossil fuels, on the other hand, contain carbon that should be in long-term storage, because remember that should be a carbon sink where it doesn't come back out. And so when we burn fossil fuels, we're using up that ancient oxygen, and we learned about that when we learned about how the Amazon forest is not the Earth's lungs. It was ancient forests and ancient algae that produced that oxygen that we rely on. So when you use fossil fuels and combust fossil fuels, you're releasing that ancient carbon and you're absorbing ancient oxygen. And so that is not a carbon neutral process when we're looking at, the short human lifespan. Okay, so just want to remind you of that. Photosynthesis takes water, carbon dioxide, sunlight, gives us oxygen and plant tissues. Combustion is the reverse reaction of that. So you take the fossil fuel with oxygen, that makes it a combustion reaction, and you're going to release carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And so we know that those are reverse reactions from each other, and you need to be familiar with how they are reverse reactions. Okay, so the fuel wood crisis. We've talked about the fuel wood crisis a couple of times. The fuel wood crisis is normally what we see in developing countries that rely on biomass for their energy, for lighting, cooking, and heating. These are places that typically do not have electrical energy, or at least not reliable electrical energy. So they are, we're not talking about, refrigerators and televisions and light bulbs. We're talking about a much simpler way of life. With the fuel wood crisis, what happens is as populations grow and people are continually burning sticks and wood and plants around these areas or villages, the women and girls who are tasked with collecting the wood have to travel farther and farther each time. And so in some places now that they are in a true fuel wood crisis, women and girls are spending more than 6 hours a day just to collect enough wood and water to, have basic food and washing at home. And so the crisis there comes in with, if you don't have available energy, then Girls spend all day collecting firewood, which means they don't go to school, which means they have lower literacy levels, which means they're less likely to be employed outside of the home, which means they have more babies, which means a bigger population, and we start that whole process all over again. If you remember, we talked about Wangari Maathai and her Greenbelt movement in Africa, where she started employing women to grow trees so they could have fuel wood and they wouldn't have this fuel wood crisis. Another way that we can combat the fuel wood crisis is things like solar cookers. So this is a village solar cooker, and it basically looks kind of like a satellite dish, except for it's these mirrors that concentrate sunlight into the central part, and then bread, meat, vegetables can all be, and water can be heated in this central thing, and the village can share it. But having one of these means that girls get to go to school, and so it's kind of a new renewable form of cooking that can save women a lot of time in many parts of the developing world. While talking about that, I want you to kind of, if you'll go back to the actual PowerPoint, so you can click on this link, there's something called the Maasai Project, which is happening in developing parts of Africa, and it's employing women, which we know reduces the overall total fertility rate, and it provides a clean energy source, which is better for everyone on the planet, in remote villages that are really far from an electrical grid. So they would not otherwise have the ability to have any type of electricity. Now they may be able to using this Maasai Project. And so I want you to read that article and think about what are the advantages of the program and what are the disadvantages of the program. And that kind of goes with low-tech alternatives to biomass. Okay, so another type of biomass are ethanols. Ethanols are called biofuels, and ethanol is an alcohol. So basically high sugar plants like corn, sugar cane, sugar beets are allowed to ferment, and that's an anaerobic process, so no oxygen is needed. The bacteria act upon those and they produce an alcohol. And the alcohol that we're looking at here is ethanol. We have used ethanol in gasoline for a very long time, and we actually use something called gasohol. So if you have if you're using E85, for example, if you've ever seen that at a gas station, it has to do with the percentage of ethanol versus gasoline. If you're using, 87, then that means that a higher percentage of it is gasoline versus ethanol. 87 versus 90. 90 has more gasoline than it does ethanol. But it's been used as a gasoline additive for years, and some flex fuel vehicles can run on 85% or greater of ethanol. And so, we don't necessarily have a lot of those fueling stations in Okeechobee, but you can see them in other bigger metropolitan areas. The good thing is that it's clean burning, because the ethanol that's produced came from carbon that was done in photosynthesis, and so that was absorbed in photosynthesis. So when that carbon is released in combustion, it's going to be equivalent or carbon neutral. But the question is, how was that plant grown? If that plant was grown using intensive agriculture, often like how corn is grown and sugarcane, intensive agriculture with lots of fertilizers, lots of pesticides, lots of irrigation water, heavy equipment, all of those things involved fossil fuels. And so it may actually end up to have a negative net energy yield. And so what a net energy yield means, or negative net energy yield, means that more energy was used to create it than what we get from burning the ethanol. And so we have to be really cautious about that. We're going to talk about one of the consequences of ethanol globally that we wouldn't see necessarily in the United States, but could really matter for some people in other parts of the world in just a second. So there are some new bioethanol options, and that's where we use faster crops and maybe even genetically modified crops in order to, ferment anaerobically in order to become ethanol. And one of those is a plant called switchgrass. It can be grown very, very quickly. It does not require a lot of energy in order to grow it or harvest it, and so it may have a better conversion ratio or net energy yield, because not as much energy is required to get the grass to grow. We can also use something called cellulosic ethanol, and cellulosic basically means plant cell residue. So we take the leftovers from, say, sugarcane, when they collect the sugarcane and they press it to remove the cane juice. We've got all this plant material left over. It still has a pretty high sugar content. We can take that and we can allow that to ferment, turn into ethanol. And so, since we're using it from waste, has a better net energy yield. It's called either, I don't know how to say either of them, but bagasse or bagasse. You may see it written either way. But that's that sugar cane residue turned into ethanol. Okay, the good thing about using both switchgrass and crop residues for ethanol is that we don't have to risk food prices going up. So if we think about, say, using corn for ethanol, well, corn is also a major food staple for people around the world. So if we start converting more corn into ethanol, the price of food corn will go up because the supply has gone down. And so if the price goes up, for many people in many parts of the world, that would be devastating to the family. It would involve, extreme hunger because they could no longer afford that major carbohydrate for their diets. So by using residues and by using non-edible plant material, we reduce the risk of food poverty. Okay, so we need to look at textbook 15.6. So you're going to read pages 474 to 477, I believe. Answer those checkpoint questions back on your chapter 15 page. I realize that they may be out of order, and that's okay, because our curriculum doesn't always match what the textbook has. If there's anything that you read and you feel like, I need to add that back into my notebook, please make sure you add that back into your workbook pages. Okay, for your activity page, you're going to read the article. So again, you'll have to go to the actual PowerPoint so you can click on the link. And it talks about algae, because remember, algae is a plant matter, and so an algae can grow very quickly. So how could algae be the answer to several of our environmental concerns, including our concerns about biofuels? So if you'll read that quick little article and answer those questions on the biomass activity page. If you add pictures or visuals, that could be extra credit for that page. Okay, so that concludes topic 6.7. Let's make sure that we've hit our objective and we've hit our vocabulary. Did we describe the effects of the use of biomass and power generation on the environment? Yes. We know that biomass is from recent living or recently living material. Ethanol, it comes from the anaerobic fermentation of plant sugars. We know the net energy yield has to do with how much energy is produced versus how much energy it took to grow that crop. And so sometimes corn has a negative net energy yield. And we know that biomass technically is carbon neutral because the only carbon it releases in combustion is equivalent to the carbon it absorbed in photosynthesis. Okay, that concludes our lecture.